El nombre de Abramson resuene con fuerza y ha venido aquí para hablar de la importancia de la narrativa, ¿no? Que me parece que a todos nos preocupa mucho y por eso yo no voy a repasarme más, voy a dar la palabra a Abramson, aunque de acuerdo con la escaleta del acto creo que ahora vamos a ver un pequeño spot, si me equivoco que alguien me lo diga. Vemos un spot y ya os dejo con Abramson. Thank you, Jill, for coming here. Welcome to Madrid, welcome to the University of Navarra, to Fundación Rafael de Pino. And gracias a todos por estar aquí con nosotros, conversando sobre el periodismo. Gracias.
Trasciendan de la anécdota.
Las grandes historias interesarán siempre.
Al final es lo que nos mueve a los periodistas, la curiosidad.
Estar en la calle, que es preguntada, que es ir a buscar noticias, que es contar historias, que es ir con tu libreta a tomar apunte.
Hay que pisar la calle, fundamental.
Dejar que el mundo te sorprenda.
Hay una historia interesante, esa historia se va a buscar todos los enfoques.
Tenemos la responsabilidad de informar de todo lo que está pasando.
Al lector le sigue interesando quiénes son las personas que están detrás de lo que está cambiando el mundo.
El tema te lo da la propia vida. La muerte, la vida, el dolor, la alegría, la esperanza.
Lo importante es qué cosas estás contando, qué forma estás contando.
Lo que eres capaz de hacer, las historias que eres capaz de contar, sea como sea, son las que te definen.
Es el oficio más apasionante del mundo.
It always helps when you press on. As preparation to be in a bilingual environment last night in my hotel, I actually ordered the movie Gone Girl, but with Spanish dubbing. I'm not sure I would pass a test of all of the intricacies of the plot of that movie, but am very touched and gratified by the lovely introductions that preceded my talk. And as most of you know, I'm going to speak today about the vital importance of great narrative writing in journalism. And I'm going to start off looking backwards, and then I'm going to look forward as well. But, you know, back in the 1840s in England, people would gather on the docks in London in great crowds, and they were waiting. And what they were waiting for is the boats that would be delivering that month's installment of Charles Dickens' Old Curiosity Shop. Londoners were on pins and needles wondering what is going to become of Little Nell, who's the main character of that novel. And I cite that, you would say, why does that have anything to do with journalism today? Because I think it points out a basic hunger and human need for the greatest kind of storytelling. And I thought of Dickens a lot, really, over last Christmas, because in the United States, the most popular thing in journalism by far was something called Serial. It's a podcast that the audience you listen to it through your ears, and it was a story that was put together by a crime reporter for the Baltimore Sun, not even one of the best-known newspapers in the United States. But what she did is a meticulous dissection of a murder that was actually a very old murder. It had occurred in 1999. It was a murder of a high school girl, and her boyfriend at the time had been convicted of killing her and had been sentenced to life in prison. And what Serial was, it was the story of that case, and what the journalist, whose name is Sarah Koenig, what she found in poring back over the case. And in the US, the Serial took off like wildfire. Podcasting is kind of a small medium, but Serial, the podcast, within 1 month, and it was an installment each week, so that would be after the 4th installment of Serial. They had over 1 million listeners who were addicted to this story and waiting with bated breath for each new installment, which came out on Thursday mornings. There were 12 of them, and now, because of the popularity of this edition of Serial, it's been announced that Sarah Koenig is going to be doing a second case a year from now. So they're going to repeat the process all over again, but with a different story. But I don't, the reason I talked about Little Nell is I actually think in some ways Serial is the new thing. It's the thing that got everybody's attention in the United States just over Christmas. But it's not really the new thing. It's the old thing. It's Little Nell and the old curiosity shop, and taking advantage of what I was referring to as what I think is a human hunger for the well-told, well-reported story. And I think that that hunger and appetite is greater now than it has ever been. Matthew Arnold, who was a poet and critic, a little bit later than Charles Dickens, but he had a fabulous definition for journalism. He said that journalism was simply storytelling with a purpose. And I think that that is not a bad definition for the work that many of us are engaged in. And I have been very personally involved in the creation of long, deep narrative, really throughout my career. At the Wall Street Journal, I was mainly an investigative reporter. I wrote many long stories about various political scandals in Washington, and I always tried to make the stories as juicy as I possibly could so that I could interest readers and they wouldn't get bogged down in the details of financial transactions and whatnot. I wrote a lot of long narratives about both Bill and Hillary Clinton, and not all of them did they like. But, I think that my power to tell narrative stories is what the New York Times was interested in when I went to the Times in 1997. And there I was involved and on the cutting edge of many great narrative, long series and narrative pieces, many of which won Pulitzer Prizes. And in the little video that we just saw, they flashed one of the stories that I'm very proud of was called Snowfall. It was about an avalanche in the Cascade Mountains in Washington, the state of Washington, out in the western U.S., where some backcountry skiers were skiing. There was a sudden avalanche, and several of them were killed in that avalanche. And the story at one level is an adventure story gone awry. It's very gripping just on that human level, but the story also manages to give you the whole science of why avalanches happen and the effects of environmental change on the increasing numbers of these fatal avalanches. And it was most of all a fully multimedia presentation of a long narrative story, beautifully designed, where the multimedia parts, where it was the video testimony of the characters or motion graphics explaining the terrain of this mountain, all of it deepened the reading in a way that was wholly original and excited readers globally. Just like I was saying, Serial was last Christmas's phenomenon. Snowfall became, a multimedia phenomenon, and people were very excited to see the Times blazing a new trail in multimedia narrative storytelling. Other kinds of very engaging, deep narrative stories that I was very involved in publishing at the Times were stories about political corruption inside the leadership of China. And those were complicated stories, but very engaging stories as well. And one of them, it turned out, one of the leaders of the Chinese Bureau, his mother, who was just an older woman living in a tiny town, had become, billionaire on diamonds. And it was just like a very, as I said, engaging, involving narrative story. That too won a Pulitzer, as did Snowfall. We did a very long and involved examination of the Apple economy and whether the runaway popularity of Apple's products was generating enough jobs and economic benefits in the U.S. where Apple is based. So, that my calling has really been as an editor, the longer narrative stories. And I think that there is that no one can really mount an argument that there isn't still a giant audience, hunger for, and profit to be made off of skillfully constructed narrative and deeply reported narrative journalism. It's certainly, there are no signs that it's going away. I'm well aware, as I'm sure all of you are, that we're told readers right now have a kind of ADD, that between constantly looking at our cell phones and watching YouTube videos, that no one has a long attention span anymore, and everybody wants everything short, as short as possible. And yes, it's true, they do want some things that are short, but what I see going on in the media landscape is that many digitally native news organizations, and I'll name just a few, the Huffington Post, which I think all of you are aware is making a big push globally. BuzzFeed, which is growing very quickly. Vice Media, which has very popular videos on the web and its own YouTube channel. And I myself am involved now with a journalist named Steve Brill in a digital narrative storytelling startup. In each of the cases of those organizations, they are investing more journalists and more of their reportorial muscles in the creation of long and investigative narrative stories. So what you're seeing is digital platforms where, yes, The short is thriving. You know, BuzzFeed still will have, you know, the picture chains of the adorable puppies and kittens that all of us love to look at while we're at work. But mixed in with that are they just published an excellent long investigation of immigration problems in the United States that was deeply reported, and it was long, and I believe that BuzzFeed was very pleased with the traffic that it got, that people will read long stories if they're beautifully told and presented in a way that people will enjoy reading them. It's very thrilling for me to be here at the university because it is so involved, especially at its main campus in Pamplona, in preparing the next generation of journalists to be the best storytellers that the world has ever seen. And right now I'm involved in similar work at Harvard University where I teach a writing seminar where we focus on, guess what, long narratives. But I too am trying to teach the next generation of journalists how to report and put together great longer stories. And, you know, if some of you are, I can't tell, a few of you are looking at me with slightly skeptical expressions on your faces. And so I'm going to, turn my argument about the value of narrative in a slightly different direction and talk a little bit about the intersection of narrative and advertising. Because the skill of being able to be a great and clear storyteller, a clear writer, a good engaging storyteller, it's of immense value right now, that skill. It transcends just about every field that you or I could name, whether it's medicine, where doctors have to write up a case study on a patient. And Harvard right now, I'm involved in some interesting talks with some of my colleagues at Harvard about trying to make Harvard a center of narrative, a kind of multidiscipline center of narrative, because that skill, storytelling, is at a premium right now. And where it has to do with advertising, as I'm sure here in Spain, just like in the United States, everyone is talking about native advertising or something called branded advertising. And really, all that advertising is storytelling. It's advertising that doesn't want to look overtly like an ad and wants to resemble more journalism and stories. And it's advertising that is a little bit more subtle in how it promotes its brand. But it rests, if it's successful, on a writer's ability to tell a clear and compelling and engaging story. What worries me about native advertising is when it fools readers, when it's intended to fool a reader and there isn't anything in a magazine or something else you're looking at that shows you somewhere that it's an ad that's different from the rest of the news or journalism content on the page. And, you know, I think most of what I've seen, certainly in the New York Times so far, does not attempt to confuse readers. But it looks a lot like journalism stories. But it's a whole form of advertising that's become, you know, multi-million-dollar business, certainly in the U.S. And if it hasn't hit here with the same ferocity, I feel certain that it will. But to succeed and have a compelling piece of native advertising, you have to have skilled writers and storytellers who know how to create that advertising. And I think like a week before I left on this trip, Condé Nast, which is the publisher of Vogue and Vanity Fair and the New Yorker magazine, they made a big announcement that they're going to have an in-house native advertising writing department. And I think in some cases they're even going to use some of their writers to write these native ads because there's so much demand for it. So when I say the skills of narrative are marketable, I'm not only talking about within the news or a news story. I'm talking about across the spectrum. And I think that is presents all of us who have worked on becoming clear and compelling writers and creative thinkers and who are diggers, going out, witnessing things and gathering important testimony from people in order to tell stories. I think that is all really, really good, important news. I would like to just, I guess, add 2 caveats. That's, within this umbrella where I see narrative flourishing and a robust market for it, I worry, frankly, about 2 trends that might get in the way of the future flourishing of narrative. And the first, and this is more geared towards the university world. In the US, and I'm told it's true in Europe too, the study of the humanities, of great literature and art and music and philosophy and related subjects has been in decline. And that's for a number of reasons. It certainly isn't because there are fewer great books to study, or it isn't a fascinating field of study. It's because of economic pressures that students feel right now, a combination of, certainly in the United States, I know it's a little less true in Europe, but the cost of a university education has gone through the roof in the US, and many students graduate with a lot of debt. And that combined with a somewhat tough economy means that students feel under a lot of pressure to study things that they think are going to help them get a job when they graduate. And I guess being, a student of in the United States, a literature major is usually called English, and that's the department that I teach in at Harvard. I don't think an English degree is seen as a powerful ticket in today's job market. But what I'm trying to do is turn that a little bit around by saying the power of being able to write clearly and make a narrative is in fact a good ticket to a job. It may not be as obvious a ticket as emerging from college as a computer technologist or with an economics degree, but that those talents are important too. And I would just say to anyone who is a student in the audience that the main reason to study the humanities and literature and related subjects is that you will develop the lifelong joy, the lifelong pleasure of great books and great works of art. For the rest of your life, those great books and great works are going to enrich your life and be the best kind of company over time that you can have. But you know, the fields are a little bit in retreat, and in some places they're in severe retreat. At the most prestigious universities in the U.S., like Yale or Harvard, the number of English majors has gone down by more than half just from about 1991. So it's been a very rapid fall off. And the most popular course for freshmen, the new students at Harvard right now, is Introduction to Computers. There are hundreds and hundreds of students for that course. Economics runs second. And you know, one of the goals I have about spending a lot of my working life now at Harvard is to try to do whatever I can, working with like-minded colleagues, to make the humanities the happening part of Harvard University again. Because the faculty there of professors teaching these subjects is, you know, just amazing. They're the very best people in their field. And you know, I think that what worries me about the retreat of the humanities in universities is that it breeds, I'm worried, a kind of technical narrowness and not being at school for the love of learning, which is a very good reason to be at a university, even during times when there's a terrible financial crisis out there. And you know, I hardly have blinders on. I realize, you know, the severe pressures that all of you are under, thinking about, am I going to be able to get employment after my time at a university? I understand that. But I think it's a mistake to study something just because you think it's going to look good on a resume and help you get a job. Because I think if you can get across to employers that what they need are more workers who think clearly and write clearly and can help in those ways promote the success of a company, that you may find that that's in the end a bigger way that you can succeed in whatever field you go into than having a very narrow technical expertise. So I wanted to leave that up with the humanities message with you today. The other thing I frankly worry about, you know, when I look at the future of quality journalism is censorship. And I'd like first to talk about the way I've witnessed censorship directly in my country, and then talk about it a bit globally. When I was an undergraduate at Harvard, it was during the time of big anti-war sentiment over the war in Vietnam, and the Pentagon Papers were leaked. And that began a tradition in the U.S. of what we call whistleblowing. Sources who work inside the U.S. government, usually on matters pertaining to national security, who, because they think they are witnessing something illegal or they're witnessing the U.S. government lying to the people, they feel that they have no recourse but to go to the press to make public the behavior that they are witnessing. And in the case of Daniel Ellsberg, he leaked to the New York Times, and the Times in 1971 published the Pentagon Papers, which was essentially a false history of the Vietnam War that the Pentagon had written, that showed the war going much better than in fact it had. And the Times ended up publishing many stories based on the Pentagon Papers. I think it was critical in opening the eyes of the American public to the real dimensions of the Vietnam War. And it resulted in a legal case and a decision that was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court, which is a very important free press decision. The Supreme Court said in the Pentagon Papers case that an American newspaper could not be enjoined or prevented from publishing an article before publication. Like, basically what that decision meant is you can't tell an American newspaper or television network that they can't go public with a story. You can try to prosecute them after the story is published, but not before. And that was called that there's a law of no prior restraint in the U.S. And hold that thought, because I'm not going to give you a tedious history lesson, but that comes into play that right in the recent Snowden case. Keep in mind that, you know, in terms of just a bit more history, that in the U.S., the founders of America were very committed to a free press. Thomas Jefferson famously said that if he had to choose between having a government and no newspapers, or newspapers and no government, he would reluctantly pick the latter. The press was seen as a vital institution to hold government accountable and prevent tyranny, prevent overly centralized power. And that's why the First Amendment, which is the amendment to the Constitution, which spells out, you know, expansive freedom of the press, it's the First Amendment. It's first for a reason. It's because the founders of America thought freedom of the press was so important. And where that comes into play with Snowden is that The Guardian, as you know, in England, was the first newspaper that Edward Snowden contacted. Snowden had been an analyst for the NSA. He saw what he thought was an illegal amount of overly expansive and intrusive government eavesdropping on the phone calls and emails and other communications of Americans, and of Americans speaking with people with foreign sources. And he decided he needed to go to the press because, as he's explained, he felt that if these programs were enacted, and they were enacted secretly in most cases, they were part of a war on terror being waged in the name of the American people. And he felt that the public needed to know the contours and dimensions of that war in order to know whether the people consented to that kind of dramatic, expansive eavesdropping. It is technically illegal for people who work for the government to leak classified information to the press. That was true in the WikiLeaks case too, in which I worked closely with colleagues at El País and The Guardian again in a consortium to go through those documents and attempt to publish them in a responsible way. But you know, what happens in the U.S. is we still have no prior restraint because of the Pentagon Papers case. That, interestingly enough, was not true in England, where The Guardian operates. So while The Guardian published the first big Snowden stories, GCHQ, which is kind of the equivalent in England of the NSA, the GCQ basically came to Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, and said to him, "You've had your fun now, and now you have to hand over all of the Snowden material. We're not going to let you keep it, and you are going to have to destroy it, or we're going to raid your offices and take it." And in England, there isn't the kind of prior restraint protection that we have in the United States. And as I said, I had worked with The Guardian and Alan, along with Thais on WikiLeaks, and I had been in contact with him from the moment that the Snowden story broke, and luckily he decided that it would be prudent to share the Snowden materials with the New York Times, to actually move that material from Britain, which does not have as strong an anti-censorship tradition as the US does. And so, I'm not going to say who, but someone Alan and I both work closely with brought, and you know, it's amazing what you can now get on a tiny little zip drive, but into my office landed, you know, the Snowden documents, which of course the New York Times has kept under very tight security and has handled very responsibly. But the reason that the Times came into the story and began publishing with The Guardian again is because of that legal difference, really. Because ultimately, the British government did actually come to The Guardian, and Alan Rusbridger and his staff had to take sledgehammers to the computers where the GCHQ documents were being kept. And you know, sometime over the summer, I had dinner in New York with Alan Rusbridger, The Guardian's editor, and he took out of his pocket this little shard, and it was like a little piece of one of the disk drives that had been sledgehammered. And I said to him, I bet you could get a pretty good price on eBay for those shards. But what worries me in the U.S. isn't then that the New York Times or other great newspapers can't continue to publish these stories. It's that the Bush and Obama administrations have been very aggressive in prosecuting the leakers, prosecuting Chelsea Manning, who was the source of WikiLeaks, prosecuting Edward Snowden. There have been 9 criminal leak cases, and in some of them, the government has tried to subpoena reporters to compel them to say who their sources are. And you know, I think it's a very regrettable trend. It's one that has made reporting in Washington extremely difficult. If you're doing any reporting on national security, the last thing that someone who works at the NSA or the CIA or the Pentagon wants is to have a paper trail of calls from a reporter. The reporters for the New York Times who cover national security have told me recently that the atmosphere has never been more difficult to do their work. And that means that I worry that the public will not get the information that it needs to really keep the government accountable and make sure that all of these national security programs are ones that they feel are consistent with a country that prizes and always has prized civil liberties. So that's a worrisome trend in the U.S. And then, you know, I spoke a few minutes ago about my pride in the long narrative that we published in the Times about the political corruption in China. And about 45 seconds after we published that story, we had translated it into Mandarin. So that went up on our NYT website. And about 27 seconds after the story went up on the website in China, the Chinese government blocked the New York Times website, and it's remained blocked for nearly 2 years. When I was in China the last time, some months ago, I could not access anything from the Times when I was in Beijing. Just nothing came up. Now, you know, I could have gotten hold of something called a VPN, which allows you to, you know, get around the censors. But evidently, China is cracking down on that kind of activity too. And I actually wanted to know what it felt like not to be able to read the New York Times when I was in, you know, a huge city and metropolitan center like Beijing, and it made me very angry not to be able to read it. And so I think that if, like me, you are deeply committed to the future of quality journalism, we want to have the broadest impact that we can achieve with our work. We want, you know, the wonderful thing about digital publishing is that you have a global audience. It is by nature global, but if certain countries are censoring what's on the web, you don't have a true global audience. And I think that is very, very worrisome. And I really hope that the Chinese president decides to unblock the New York Times. They blocked Bloomberg too. I would like to see Bloomberg unblocked as well. But so those are, I guess, a little bit the worries that I have, but neither of them really diminishes my incredible optimism about the future of narrative. Last just quick point about censorship is self-censorship can be a problem. And I just wanted to give, since I'm here in Madrid and we've had, you know, the HSBC story has been such a big story, and the secret Swiss bank accounts that many wealthy people around the world have used to secretly shield their wealth from tax authorities and others. I just think it's great that El Confidencial published the names of the people in Spain who had these accounts, and I understand not everybody dared to publish the names. It's a big news story. It's absolutely newsworthy information, and I think it's great to see a mainly digital newspaper step up and play a vigorous role in truth-telling. So I think I'll end with that and really look forward to answering your questions about anything at all. So thank you.
It's great to be hopeful and see that good stories are always on demand. So we have a bright future. Now, voy a dar paso a las preguntas. Solamente dos cosas antes de las preguntas. Una es, me gustaría que el que pueda hacerlas en inglés las haga en inglés. Si no, se las traducimos aquí y ya está, no hay problema. Pero el que pueda hacerla en inglés, la hace en inglés y así ganamos un poco de tiempo. Y luego también les pediría brevedad en la formulación. Because we want to take advantage of the time it still has. So Entonces me gustaría que fuerais, en la medida de lo posible, breves. Bueno, ahí...
Thank you. Pleased to meet you, Jill. Thank you very much for coming here. My name is Gustavo Garcia Mancilla. I'm the director of the Executive Media MBA program of the University of Navarra here in Madrid, where we try to convert journalists into businessmen or women, which is not an easy task, as you may know. And I wanted to ask you something very related with the business side of journalism, and taking advantage of your previous and recent experience at the New York Times. And I'd like to know, how did you live from the inside of the company, the process of the implementation of the paywall at the New York Times? All the journalistic companies are trying to monetize their digital contents and trying to get money from that. And you were one of the pioneers in implementing this kind of paywall platforms. And I would like to know, not from the marketing or financial point of view, because that's been already published in many sources, even in the Harvard Business School, a case they have published. But how you lived in terms of change management, mind changing, and how to adapt journalists already accustomed to work in the analogic world, and for making money and working as a journalist in the digital world. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the great question. At the point, it's now nearly 8 years ago that the Times made the decision to have a paid digital subscription plan. It felt like the riskiest kind of decision to make, to live through that period. It was a very interesting period of time inside the Times, and there was quite passionate argument among the top news editors and some of the top people who worked in advertising and other areas of the business life of the Times, because we roll back the camera to that period of time. The ethos for digital publishing was news wants to be free. Everybody believed that, and nobody really thought that you could charge for news on the web. Largely because there is so much of it. There's so much news for free on the web. Few people thought that you could actually ask people to pay for news content and get them to pay. The thinking inside the Times evolved in an interesting way. And I should point out, while I was very, very involved. I was then managing editor of the Times, very involved in the discussions. That the decision ultimately was made by the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., after hearing out everybody and thinking about it. The reason that the Times decided to have a digital subscription plan was, number one, and it remains the most important reason, we felt that the content in the Times, the news articles, were of such value and quality that people would definitely pay to read this content, that our journalism was on a higher plane than all the stuff that was out there for free on the internet. And that remains, I think, quality journalism remains the business model of the New York Times. So that's first and foremost. Number two, I think it just seems, and I would broaden this beyond the Times, that it would seem dangerous to have a digital business model that is solely based on digital advertising. That we're seeing the same kind of cyclical ups and downs in digital ads as print newspapers and magazines have been struggling with on the advertising front with print ads. And to have all of your eggs in the basket of digital advertising didn't seem like a great growth model looking ahead to the future. Now, the reason that the decision to have a paid subscription plan was risky is, like, what will happen to your audience? Is your audience going to shrink, and therefore the impact of your stories will not be as large? And so therein was the brilliance, and it was mainly my colleagues on the business side of the Times. I did not design the way our digital subscription plan worked, but what it did is it kept a lot of the Times in the open web. For instance, if you link from somewhere else to a New York Times story, you can read that story and not have to pay. But the way the subscription plan worked is that it fell on the heaviest users of Times content, people who were habitual big readers of many articles in the Times every day. And we felt it's fair to ask them to pay, and we did. And it's turned out to be a very significant paid digital subscriptions is a very significant revenue stream for the New York Times now. In some ways, the fact that you have advertising and digital subscriptions, that mirrors the business model that has sustained print newspapers forever, which is advertising, newsstand, and home subscriptions. It's two streams of revenue. And right now, I think the Times has said publicly they are aiming to have 1 million digital-only subscribers. I think they're above 800,000 by now, and it's a great thing. It's been a success.
All right. Mark, over there.
Hi. Thank you, first and foremost. It was a most insightful lesson. Sorry, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my name is Pablo Castillo. I also work at the University of Navarre, but I'm not a journalist myself. I'm more in the field of dramatic writing, fiction writing.
That's the humanities.
There you go. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I loved your talk, is that you put a strong emphasis on storytelling. And I think that emotion is a very important part of that. But on the other hand, I remember also from my days at school, from my journalism professors going on and on about objectivity in journalism, and trying to make sure not to take sides and let the reader pick their sides and so on and so forth. So I guess my question is a double question. Is emotion an essential part of journalistic storytelling? And if it is, does that make it an enemy of objectivity? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I don't think emotion is the enemy of objectivity. I also think objectivity is one of those words that, has a diffuse kind of meaning. Because I don't think objective journalism, news stories that have half and half quotes from people who think one way about something and the other way about something. I think objectivity in a journalist is going into a story with your mind open, without having having a preconceived conclusion before you've gone out and done the reporting. It's then doing a very thorough job of reporting and exposing yourself to various viewpoints on an issue you're writing about. But at a certain point, it's the weight of the evidence you've collected points to a truth. I don't think journalists should be shy about writing it that way, as long as that kind of rigorous fact-finding process has been gone through. And I think emotion is vital, often in the kinds of long narrative stories I've been talking about. That, for instance, one of the big projects that I worked on towards the end of my run at the Times was a 7-part series that was about a homeless girl in Brooklyn. And it was those stories were very emotional. You got very attached. You know, in a way, it's back to Little Nell. The reader got very involved, and what made you read day to day was that kind of basic narrative tension of, is the name of the girl in Brooklyn homeless stories was Dasani. It was like, is Dasani going to be okay? That is what kept you reading on, and you got very emotionally involved in the other members of her family and with her teachers. And I think that kind of involvement with a piece that's character-driven is healthy and helps make a long piece engaging and helps, you know, kind of keep readers going, especially through a multi-part series.
Hi. I'm a 5th-year student at the University of Navarre in journalism and philosophy. And my question today has to do with one of the concerns that you talked about with censorship of the government, but also one that I've heard you talk about being the economic situation in our field to have boots on the ground abroad. We see the same correspondence from these major networks appearing in all of the hotspots within the same week, and other networks that can't afford to have boots on the ground, depending on stringers. So on the one hand, you have the government, which is more controlling, more aggressive than ever with the press, and on the other hand, this economic situation isn't allowing for the journalists to give the public the information it needs. So would it be exaggerated to say that this is undermining the very rationale for having freedom of press, or is it building the perfect storm for the government and other administrative bodies to be more in control and be able to manipulate with more facility the American people? Thank you.
And that is, you know, a very serious issue that I've devoted a lot of time to, because, you know, we now have been through more than a decade where many newsrooms have made severe cuts to the numbers of correspondents that they have, and particularly have retreated U.S. publications from foreign postings. I remember I made a trip to the Middle East with a New York Times correspondent named Michael Slackman, who had been based in Cairo, and he was near the end of his run in that job, and he was just saying over the course of his years there, it went from like being a city that had lots of different foreign correspondents posted. I mean, Cairo, think what a hotbed of news Cairo has been, that there were many colleagues from other news organizations based there when he was first assigned, but by the year that he was getting ready to leave, I think he said there are only three full-time correspondents. And, you know, there are some foreign capitals that have nobody. I was very powerfully moved over the summer. I was reading a piece in the Times Sunday opinion section, which is called The Review, and it was an article that was written by a woman who had been a stringer, I think for the Associated Press in the Congo. And she had served in that capacity, I think she said for 5 years, but then she had to leave and move somewhere else to do her work. But the point she made is that she was not replaced. She was, a stringer working there. She wasn't replaced. And she was saying effectively there was not any full-time correspondent focused on the Congo, where in that civil war, there have been, a horrifying number of casualties over time. And to have, that place basically uncovered is really something. And the Congo isn't the only place of that type that I could mention. So it's a concern. The other thing that concerns me a lot that you didn't mention, but I think is linked to your question, is the attacks on journalists in dangerous places. I worry particularly about stringers and freelancers who aren't, they don't have the training or the protective backing of a major news organization like the BBC or again the New York Times or Reuters, and something happens, something terrible happens. Some of them don't even have insurance for those situations. And I was happy I met just a month or so ago in Brooklyn with, again, a new group of digital journalists. They're called Story Hunter, and the people involved in that, they're trying to put together a network of international freelancers to help be a clearinghouse for their assignments and to match them up with news organizations that need, let's say, someone in the Congo to do some reporting. But they're also, thank goodness, they're gonna provide insurance and some training for these journalists. So I think that at least is a ray of hope.
Creo que tenemos tiempo para dos preguntas. Ahí hay una y ahí hay otra. Ya lleva un tiempo. Okay, adelante. A ver si llega el micrófono.
My name is Joan Lerat, and I'm here as a subscriber of the New York Times. And my question is, how do you compare the roles of Carlos Slim at the New York Times with that of Rupert Murdoch at the Wall Street Journal?
I mean, I don't think that there's any comparison. Carlos Slim is a major shareholder in the New York Times. He, as far as I know, has never involved himself in any aspect of the news coverage of the New York Times. I think in all of the 17 years that I worked at the Times, someone told me like he was taken through the newsroom once, and I was actually at work that day, and he was so unobtrusive I didn't even get to meet him. So he, is at more than an arm's length distance from the production of the actual journalism of the New York Times. Rupert Murdoch is the owner of the Wall Street Journal and, has his hands in everything. It's a completely different relationship. I spent 10 years of my career at the Wall Street Journal as pre-Murdoch, and I guess I shared some of the same fears that a lot of my friends and colleagues who worked there during the transition had about how Rupert Murdoch would change the Wall Street Journal. But I have to say, basically it's still, one of the best quality newspapers in the world. and he has made changes, but it's still a fantastic read.
My name is Anthony Piquet. I work in a small newspaper, maybe the latest print one I've read in Europe. It's 4 years old. Thanks for your wisdom. I read the innovation report, and I would like to know if you share this view that the obsession for the A1 page, the first page, sucks all energies of the organization first, and then if you have any advice for editors-in-chief to cope, like my newspaper, which is really recent, but anyway, paper operations suck in all energies, all organization, all things. And we are very well known, some people here can tell you, as very, very digital. So I would like to hear your advice. What did you find out that can help us? Thank you.
I don't agree with the innovation report's conclusion. I'm not sure they said it quite that emphatically, that it's that deciding the front page of the print newspaper sucks all of the energy out of the organization. And anecdotally, I know that isn't true because when I became executive editor, I made a decision not to go to what was called the front page meeting every day, precisely because I wanted to send a message that whether a story made the front page of the print paper was not the be-all and end-all of that story, and that any foreign correspondent for the New York Times could tell anyone that their stories get life on the web. If foreign correspondents are waiting for the print newspaper to be seen by the people that they cover, by their audience, it'd be old news by then. So no, it was not true that I think it is true that there is something special about having your story land on the front page of the print New York Times still. And it is some measure for the audience that still reads the paper in print. It is, an interesting smorgasbord of the 6 articles that the top editors at the paper do think are the most important or the most interesting on a particular day. But, the homepage of the website is just as important as is the list of top stories on the news apps. So I don't think the New York Times is a front page centric organization. And advice on, like, if you are the editor of a young newspaper, I realize there are all kinds of pressures probably bearing down on you, but I think don't have your attention diverted from just the greatness of the stories that you're publishing. That if you are publishing stories about the area, I don't know, is it a local newspaper? Yeah. Just continue to report the hell out of Barcelona and find stories that no one else is telling. And that's going to be your ticket to success, because then everybody has to read it. So don't have your head so scrambled by other worries that you're not focusing enough of your energy on that.
The last question. Now, this is really the last.
Hello? Yes. You've talked about the success of the New York Times with the subscriptions model to the website. There are other success like Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. That's true. But there are also a lot of newspapers in the world, especially in Spain, that have probably a business model problem at the moment. Many of them, they don't know what they are going to do or what they have to do. There are many also websites that are coming originally with the website. And someone said that each 10 euros they lose from advertising in print, they get 1 in the internet.
Yeah.
So how do you see the future of all these media that are having a lot of problems and a lot of and they don't know what to do with the new business model that they will have in the next years, well, from now, but especially in the next years. And I would like to know if you see the paper in print in 10 years, 15 years, do you see the paper in print? I think that you like it, because you said this a month ago in New York, but I would like to know, not only the New York Times, but the business model in general. Do you see this?
I don't think that there is a business model in general that will apply to, you know, all the media or all newspapers. And I think rather than obsessing about will there be print newspapers in 10 years, I think we should collectively focus on the important thing isn't whether newspapers survive, the important thing is that quality journalism survives. And I think it's vital to kind of change the conversation to that. And you know, what you say is true. Digital advertising alone does not bring in enough revenue to support a large newsroom. It is, you know, pennies on the dollar compared to what print advertising used to bring in. But when you say there is a business model problem, what I also suspect is that there's a quality news business model problem, and that has to be solved along with whatever, you know, payment formula you're going to try to have as a publication.
Okay, so we have to finish. Thank you very much, Jill, for all your words. Muchas gracias a todos por venir. La verdad es que para los que amamos la profesión, poder escuchar a Jill y poder escuchar nombres como New York Times, etc., pues es un auténtico regalo. Y bueno, seguimos con la conversación.